Welcome to the Library of Congress, everybody. I'm John Haskell, Director of the Kluge Center here at the library. The Kluge Center brings leading thinkers in the humanities and the social sciences to the library for periods in residence to do research in the vast collections that we have here. And the center showcases the work of those scholars in public events like this one. This afternoon, we bring you the work of the very first Library of Congress J.I. Kislak Chair in the study of the history and cultures of the early Americas, Stephen Houston. Thanks to the generous benefaction of the late J. Kislak, the chair supports in-depth research projects in archaeology, history, cartography, epigraphy, linguistics, ethnohistory, ethnography, and sociology, with an emphasis on projects that combine disciplines in novel and productive ways. By encouraging interdisciplinary inquiry, the Kislak Chair nourishes a broad conversation ranging from the technical aspects of archaeological discovery to issues of interest in the current cultural conversation. The annually appointed chair also helps to convene scholars invited by the chair for seminars, consultations, and ongoing study of the artifacts in the library's Kislak collection. I also want to alert you to the fact that we'll be announcing on May 14th the second Kislak chair who will be in residence beginning in November. The library will make an announcement at that time. Let me introduce Stephen. Steve Houston is the Dupee Family Professor of Social Science and Professor in the Department of Anthropology at Brown University. An anthropologist, archaeologist, and epigrapher, he has worked on the excavations of several major Maya cities, most recently the ancient city of Piedras Negras in Guatemala. As an epigrapher, Houston draws on inscriptions and figural art to reconstruct the political and social structure of Maya civilization, including the dynamics of royal court life and the role of religion. His interpretations of stylized representations of the human body demonstrate how displays of emotion were depicted and used by Maya elites to reinforce their status within a hierarchical society. Today, Dr. Houston will discuss ancient Maya warfare and the meanings of conflict and its aftermath, featuring the LiDAR technology now revolutionizing the study of pre-Columbian civilizations. Please join me in welcoming Steve to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John. And I also want to particularly thank John for his gracious hospitality this year and that of his capable staff. And those are some of you, or maybe all of you, are here today. And that would be, of course, Dan Torello, Michael Stratman, and Travis Hensley. It's been a pleasure being here at the library this year. My office is not quite as opulent as this. I would prefer more gilding. This is where I think the endowment should go in the future. This is also, I think, the only talk in which I'm also going to acquire a tan. I've got a fair amount of intense light coming at me. Now, this talk tonight, as John mentioned, is going to be dealing with a world that is under very direct onslaught right now, and that is a world which you can see here and to either side of the podium, the current reality of the jungle, the tropical rainforest in much of Latin America. Here is a vivid scene in which you see half that forest almost completely cut down, and the other is still standing, but probably not for long. Eventually, that forest will be incinerated, and it's going to be reduced to something like this, which is eventually probably going to be converted into pasture for cattle. It's a complex process. I regret to say that it is happening as I speak. This is a satellite image assembled only last week that delineates for you some of the intense burning that is now taking place in northern Guatemala. Those pinpricks are, of course, small bursts of fire as this forest goes up in flames. Now, on that green area to the side of this diagram, you'll also see areas that are not being burnt, and those are the ones that concern us today. And for that, I'm going to usher you on a ride with me, an imaginative one, into the deepest jungle of northern Guatemala. And this is what it does look like. It looks like something out of a bad Hollywood set from a Johnny Weissmuller movie, but it is in fact the reality that I experience every year, and one that I will experience in a few weeks when I return to excavate. I also want to give you some feeling of context. This is a talk that's going to be focused, as has been my research for decades, on lowland Maya civilization. And these are peoples, they're really many different peoples, who flourished particularly in the first 1,000 years after the time of Christ or the beginning of the Common Era. My own focus of research has been in a much more targeted region in northern Guatemala, smack dab in the middle of the Yucatan Peninsula. Many of you have probably even visited these sites, these archaeological ruins of Maya civilization. One that easily comes to mind is Tikal in northern Guatemala. That is what it looks like from a drone or maybe a low-flying helicopter. It's close, very close to the area where I have been excavating. This is the point I want to make tonight, that acquiring a visible knowledge, a kind of direct glimpse of what might be under that rich, thick forest, such as we're still fortunate to have in the Maya biosphere, is one that we have slowly begun to penetrate over the last century or so. Now, there are past practices, which I have also been involved in, now rendered, if not completely obsolete, at least not ones that we want to train our students in. This antiquity you see before you is called a plane table and alidade, and in a slide taken in the late 50s at Tikal itself, the brother of my mentor as a graduate student, this is someone named William Coe, who directed the excavations at Tikal, is in the business of mapping. It's a hard-won effort that involves a great deal of cutting. Now, sometimes the mapping doesn't necessarily involve that thick overburden of vegetation. When excavations take place, as in the mother of all trenches, which Bill Coe happened to cut through the Acropolis at Tikal, you can see that virtually every piece of masonry can be mapped and eventually drawn. Now, that project, which over a period of about approximately 10 years, a bit longer depending on how you reckon it, eventually accumulated enough information to create the maps that you see to either side of me. The little lines, of course, represent contour intervals. This is of a level of precision which is really quite astonishing. However, even this map, which was the platinum standard, or I should say the jade standard of the time, is one that's now been replaced by new technologies. Now, I mentioned before that I have blundered in my own special inept fashion through Maya archaeology over a couple of decades. These are almost historical photographs which date to about 1986, which show me and my camp in another very remote part of Guatemala. Now, one piece of advice for any grad students that might be here: don't go to do your doctoral research in guerrilla-held zones, in the conflict areas of the world, which I elected to do. And there must have been many, many guardian angels fluttering around my shoulders. Now, the logistics of working in these places can be quite difficult. And even in mapping, you have to understand that the only way in which you can bring out this cumbersome equipment is by cutting sight lines with machete. And I have all sorts of cuts over my arms that testify to the fact that the most dangerous thing in the jungle is a gringo with a machete. And I have lost a lot of blood over my own stupidity. Now, the mapping also involves working in the rainy season, which regrettably we often have to do because we have day jobs as professors and the like. And so often when I was mapping, we would take, in this case, termite nests, you mash them into punctured, dried milk containers, and you waft them around like incense burners in the vain hope of keeping off the mosquitoes. There is limited clearance that takes place. In addition to those sight lines, we'll have to do a little bit of thorougher work. And here is where some of the details become fascinating indeed. As part of my doctoral research at Yale, now over 30 years ago, we found, for instance, in these areas of limited clearance, walls that were hitherto unsuspected that indicated that these sites were somehow involved in militaristic expeditions and campaigns of over 12 to 1300 years ago. Now, eventually, after all of that mapping, we used to do another quaint activity, which was to hand calculate on very crude devices from Casio. Does that company still exist anymore? And eventually, you would draw with rapidographs and pens and pencils in the field the plot, the drawing that would lead to this kind of map, which is what I produced for my doctoral dissertation. And here you can perhaps see in sinuous outline around the center of this site some of the maps which eventually proved so fascinating. I'm going to describe this afternoon a world reordered, however, one in which there are novel perceptions that were simply inconceivable as recently as 2 to 3 years ago, and in terms of with respect to more recent captures that are going to be taking place, are going to be occurring within the next couple of months. Now, I also find it useful, though, to establish analogies to get you an idea of what it's like to go from a smudged lens to clarity of vision. And one analogy that I often think about, since I'm also quite concerned with and fascinated by art, is to consider, let's say, the contrast between the pre-cleaning of the Sistine Chapel, which all of you know about, I'm sure. It's been controversial. However, there's also reliable evidence, at least according to one school of interpretation, that has led to an entirely different view of the coloristic potentials of Michelangelo's brush. It has changed our view of Michelangelo. It has changed our view of Renaissance painting. Now, to take yet another more extreme example of how we go from the smudge lens to one that allows an utmost degree of clarity of vision, let's look at this. Now, this is where the Getty Conservation Institute worked its magic in a Flemish painting, which happened to be actually done as a fresco in Rome. The artist is Paul Brill. This is what the Getty's been able to produce. And so now we have an entirely new set of data which help to inform our understanding of Western art history. And then the final analogy, which I find most gripping because in some ways it applies most aptly, I think, to archaeology, is astronomy. Now, you're looking here literally as an occupant of the New Horizons spaceship as you're coming close in the summer of 2015 to Pluto, and you saw in that image an extraordinary precision of view that would not have been possible even as that spacecraft drew close to the planet. The new technology I'll be describing tonight is LiDAR, and as with many archaeological technologies, I can't begin to tell you how this is put together. We are simply users of the information that results from it. Now, LiDAR was originally defined as what was called light and radar. That's the correct etymology of the term, and because we like to mess things up, that LiDAR has now been reprocessed etymologically to come from light detection and ranging. That's all wrong. That's not how it came into existence. But the practice itself is one that I can describe fairly easily. Rather than cutting sight lines through the forest and endangering life and limb, there are a lot of snakes out there too, by the way. We take that device, which is emitting thousands of beams and sometimes billions of beams of laser shoots up in a plane or sometimes in a helicopter. One of these shots below is from work I'll be describing later. Now, there also needs to be someone on the ground, though, with a fixed reference point. So you have a constant, if you will, triangulation taking place between what is being shot, what is being hit on the ground, and eventually what returns, what is received in different three-dimensional locations. Now, the device we're using with our team is called the Optec Titan. It's unusual because it shoots off at 3 different directions. It's able to assess all sorts of different information, including information about the vegetation above. But what is this process, you might ask? What it involves is a little bit like a plow. Imagine, if you've ever seen one of these, a plow in a field. It goes, the oxen are not terribly agile physically. They're not going to mince around easily, and so you have to turn it around and move in the opposite direction. It is that fly line that precisely delineates what the sort of flight path would be taken on one of these aircraft, whether a chopper or a plane. Now, most of these can be understood in terms of linear segments. Now think of it this way. You've got all of those beams of light being shot out by the Optec Titan. Most will hit vegetation, but a precious few, valuable few points are going to hit that surface underneath, beyond which nothing can go. Those will then be received by sensors up in the plane with all of this algorithmic magic. You can figure out exactly where that point hit, and by a great deal of processing, you will eventually be able to come up with that kind of view of a surface. Now, one way of understanding what LiDAR is coming up for us, and I think all of you can make out that there are artificial features there, there's a Maya house mount group, in fact, are linear. These colored dots that you see up above are registering the vegetation. And then down below in that vivid dark blue, that almost a purple color, what you're getting is the surface against which the LiDAR can no longer go. Now imagine, if you will, a processing system that allows you to remove all of that vegetation, which doesn't immediately interest you at the time, and what's left behind is that surface. It is as if every last piece of vegetation has been stripped off, and there are no, like a now and now's, provided we can continue this research, lost cities among the Maya. Eventually, every last mound group will be visible. And I can say, almost with regret, almost with tears in my eyes, that this is truly a game changer in New World archaeology. Now, this is a shout out to my Irish cousins here, Erin Gobrach. Some of this work has been done in places like Ireland, and other places have been done, and I think this is particularly impressive work by my colleague and friend Damien Evans, who's been working in the great Khmer sites of Cambodia. And for those of you who are not aware of this kind of process, what Damien has been able to do with his colleagues is to actually buy a LiDAR device, and they keep flying and flying and flying, and particularly they'll focus on a site that many of you know, which is called Uncor Wat, and if you haven't been, you really should go. Here is a LiDAR image under the thick jungle of what Damien Evans and his colleagues have been able to discover. Suddenly, we see Uncor as no one has possibly glimpsed it for over 12 to 1300 years, in which features which are barely perceptible as you walk over that surface are now as clarion, as lucid, as interpretable as anything that had been possible before, and leading to yet further questions, because that is what is truly extraordinary here. It instigates further research. For instance, if we look at the bottom of sector, the southeastern part of the Uncor complex, you'll see these odd kind of features, which also are a little bit like ox plows. We don't know what these are for. Are they gardens? Who knows? But I can now take you back from these more distant areas into the Maya region itself. And here I've got to extol the work of one of the first people I excavated with, Arlen Chase, now at the University of Nevada at Las Vegas. He has LiDArized the Maya. He was the first person to decide this technology, which has been of experimental application in the 90s and then had become more popular later, particularly in Europe and other parts of the world, could be successfully applied to Maya sites. And this is the result of a ruin that I, again, lost a lot of pounds in. I actually cut my arm mapping part of this. But what we see now are all of the agricultural fields. We see the full, expansive urban landscape of Caracol, which happens to be in Belize. So this work has been tried. It's been shown to be spectacularly successful. And I was very fortunate to be involved in an initiative which is ongoing. This work is still in processing. We've published an article in Science Magazine about it, and it's the largest LiDAR capture that's ever been done of, to my knowledge, a New World civilization. It goes all the way across Guatemala, and you can see that we're focusing on particular segments that have been selected because there are pre-existing archaeological projects working there, and because also they're areas of interest. We want to get a variety across the heartland of the Maya civilization. Now, I always like to give credit where it's due. The person who helped to raise the money was Marian Hernandez. This is a Guatemalan charity covering our expenses. It's not the U.S. government, and it's not U.S. philanthropists. We have colleagues like Marcello Canuto at Tulane, Francisco Estrada Belli, who is also at Tulane, and above all, my good buddy Tom Garrison at Ithaca College, who had been a postdoc with me, and he's the one that I'm still working with very closely. This is a collaborative enterprise, and this is the important thing to emphasize sociologically, that some archaeologists operate as loners. You cannot do so when you involve yourself in LiDAR. You have to get large consortium together, and almost a kind of hive intelligence begins to accrete and operate and buzz with energy. You get to talk about things simultaneously. I see this as an important side benefit of doing the LiDAR. That's me, by the way. Now, just to show you again, I'm just humble one of many. Now, I'm going to contrast now an image which shows Tikal, the site I mentioned before, as seen today by Google Earth. And that's what the LiDAR shows us. And so every little bump there is now accessible to us, and it can be studied very closely. I'm now going to run through, now that I hope I've communicated to you something of the thrill, the excitement that is involved in doing this work, and of what it is harvesting that before had involved so much pain, so much effort, is to look at what this new project with all of these people happens to be giving us. Well, the first thing it gives us is a whole new set of arresting vistas, that is, new glimpses of Maya cities that we've studied for 150 years, but now can see in an entirely different way that is simply impossible without this technology. And heaven forfend we ever become able to see this city stripped of vegetation, because many of its treasures are ecological. We want that forest to stay put. It also allows us to obtain alternative views of a single Maya ruin. Now, this is a small Maya residential group, and I'm illustrating for you here some images taken from LiDAR. This is somewhat ways from Tikal, but by a former student of mine, Takeshi Nomoto, who's easily probably the best living Maya field archaeologist. Now look carefully at these images. Look carefully at how different sorts of processing tend to result in different glimpses of what is there. Now this is one set of filters. This is another. And suddenly different attributes, different traits begin to percolate to the surface. And then this one, which I find particularly lurid, this is a shout out to the 1960s, you can see really vivid day glow colors, but each one of them is providing a slightly different set of visual information, a different set of visual relationships, and above all, a clue as to how we should proceed in future fieldwork. Now the second thing this project has done, this mega project with all of these people, is that we've been able to assess the density of human populations in a way that was simply not possible before. Now, let's look at one area in particular. Across the Maya lowlands, each one of these little blips, each one of these little dots is a Maya mound or a pyramid. And you can see here, it's almost like looking at a nighttime view over the eastern coast of the United States. Not over Pyongyang or North Korea, I might add. And here are about 50,000 structures that are now completely open to the gaze. What the LiDAR tells us is that there isn't a uniform distribution of ancient people living in this area, but rather it tends to concentrate and become really profoundly more dense as we move towards Tikal. That would simply not have been possible before at this level of resolution. Now that's a pan-Maya view. It's across a broad expanse of territory. What about locally? Well, let's focus again on the area around Tikal, and this is an area of LiDAR capture of those points that have been processed. Every single mound group is now visible. Every single ancient settlement that happens to be visible on the surface. And you can see again, there are concentrations. There are areas where people are not living, evidently. Each one of those points to a potential plethora of doctoral dissertations. Now, at Tikal itself, I'm going to contrast for you an image of LiDAR that shows no buildings, and this is one in which all the buildings are found. The overwhelming sense is that the Maya had, indeed, a highly successful civilization that did accumulate large numbers of people, which then raises questions about how they were fed, how were they governed, and all of these ripple outwards in ways that will lead to further discovery. There are also enigmas that can only be, I think, explored by getting out there in the jungle. Far north of Tikal, for instance, are all sorts of strange features that have popped up we had no idea that existed. Long linear features, some of which might be roads, including, as you can make out perhaps to either side here, a large rectangle, which I've highlighted for you in yellow. Some more fanciful colleagues suggest these are for animal pens, which is, to me, a crazy idea, but they might have been used for agriculture. We simply don't know. Now, the other dirty little secret, you might say, about much of Maya archaeology is that, regrettably, a lot of objects are looted. They're taken illegally out of their countries of origin. What LiDAR does is it also specifies for us the location of every last looter's pit in the Maya world. We know where to explore. Now, the looter's pits are useful in another way because often they provide, regrettably but providentially, a view directly into a deeply buried Maya building, which might have, as in the case of San Bartolo in northern Guatemala, spectacular murals. So these will help too in guiding further research. These small rectangles that you see, which I've highlighted for you in red, are indicating where those looters' trenches might be. Now, this is where my talk really is focused on, which is matters of defense. And this year at the Kluge and on my Kislak chair, I've been working actually on a variety of different projects, but this is one that really does, truly thrill me. Now, this is from the same article that I did with colleagues, and you see these little color codes. Notice that the concentration of defensive features is where the people are. It's much closer to Tikal, as we'd seen before. Now, before I discuss in detail what we found there and what we hope to find as a result of future investigations, let's do a little bit of an excursus, a little bit of a digression about Maya warfare in general. And eventually this will be wrapped up back into the LiDAR. This is a project I was involved in with Mary Miller and colleagues, which is a rendering of the great Bonampak murals in Chiapas, Mexico. They are the most grandiose, complex, richly rewarding scenes of warfare in the ancient New World, perhaps even in the entire world as far as we're concerned. They're like a virtual reality. You walk into these rooms and you're surrounded almost synesthetically by all of the cacophony of battle and of fear and of anguish and of conquest and of victory. Maya warfare can be understood, I think, fundamentally in two different ways. The first is to understand that the Maya were warriors, that they had a warrior ethos, which meant that you acquired value or merit in your society by taking a captive directly. It's almost like the Plains Indians, you might say, the Lakota or other groups in the 19th century, in which taking a captive would burnish your prestige, which would make you, in fact, a more esteemed member of your society. There's a lot of evidence that that kind of warrior ethos suffuses the art of the Maya. This is a chocolate pot, and you can see here a series of captives being taken along. And those captives themselves must have been successful in an earlier stage of their lives, for they have small stuffed heads. I've highlighted for you in yellow. These are headhunters. They're people that are directly invested in physical contact with the enemy. This is not about pushing a button and releasing the missiles and so forth. Now, a few feet from where I stand, a certain gentleman mentioned the American Carnage of the last couple of years. This is really American Carnage, which is a warrior mentality in which you visit on your enemies a high degree of humiliation. You almost dehumanize them to some extent. And there's a bit of ambiguity. Sometimes captives were kept around for a long time and even entered into quasi-kin relationships with their captors. But on this pot, which is at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, you can see people who are being bloodied and humiliated. These were, I regret to say, not exactly Quakerly in mentality, and sometimes butchering is taking place as well. It is a highly sanguinary, violent society, at least at this elite level. Now, that direct contact, that physical intimacy with your captive, is something that is also strongly revealed in the hieroglyphic evidence that I've been involved, along with many colleagues, in deciphering over the last couple of decades. And these are a variety of Maya glyphs. They read, for instance, Chukach over to the upper left-hand side, or Utok Pakal in a glyph which is just to the lower side of that. Each one can be translated for you into English today. Is grabbed. It is his captor. It is he of the 7 captives. They're enumerating how many people they have directly acquired in the field of battle. And they also refer to their armament, to their flints, to their shields, which are used for protection. This kind of direct contact is, I would say, expressed overtly in some of the glyphs that I've highlighted for you here in a rectangular box. But this brings me to my second point. It isn't only about this Plains Indian, you might say, style of raiding. It isn't only like the headhunters of Borneo or the like. There were broader conflicts that elevated, for better or worse, these conflicts into a far more intense status. And these would be wars indicated by this glyph to the side. A lot of controversy about how this glyph would be read. I have thought for some time that it's a war expression that nonetheless is likening these conflicts to great storms of the sort that many of us have experienced when we work in the tropics, all that intense electrical energy that ascends into the sky and eventually is let loose with great bursts of wind and of water. Now, that kind of storm, that kind of war event, is one that we also know had many much more immediate consequences than simply getting someone's body and doing what you want with it. We know that it compelled whole cities or dynasties to leave, to go into exile. The metaphor they use is to go up, to rise. And eventually, hopefully, at the end of that process, they will arrive back once again in their comfortable home of origin. Because the Maya will sometimes refer to upsets and reversals in their historical accounts, but it always has a happy ending. They always come back to what was there before. This is, of course, the title of my talk today. It relates to the submission of these dynasties, of their flints and of their shields. Now, these impacts were, as I said, exceedingly strong, we think. And again, hieroglyphic evidence and imagery, which I have been a specialist in for some years, tells us that this warrior to the side is holding a spear. I hope many of you can see that. Also has glyphs to the side which read pului, which means something gets burned, and then right afterwards is a reference to location. So you can see it's become depersonalized. It's not only about acquiring a fixed number of captives, to which you add every year as you tally more and more. It's about far more dire things happening to far more people. Now, sometimes we even see fortresses that are rather in a stylized fashion depicted in Maya art. This is a rollout of a Maya pot made by my dear friend Justin Kerr. Maya pots are, of course, cylindrical. They wouldn't have had glass. They would have been fascinated by this material. But nonetheless, the rollout camera allows you to peel out an image in a way that the Maya would not ordinarily have accessed this kind of view. But what I'll draw your attention to, or I hope you can see, all of the warriors that might be present here. Some are holding shields, some are holding flints, and they're also here in this image to the side, someone perched up by a stylized icon for a Maya hill, and he's pelting figures down below with stones. And if I go back, you'll see that there are women involved as well. Captives have been taken. This is one in which the guiltless, the women, the children too, are going to have a violent outcome to these conflicts. It's not just warrior on warrior. We have recently discovered in the last year or so that all of these round stones that we've been worried about at Maya sites, well, it's now obvious that they're used for pelting enemies and not least for slingshots. It's a technology that is now very self-evidently involved in Maya conflict. So to summarize those 2 points about direct contact versus very general, what can we say? We can say that these conflicts were personally momentous. I would have 8 to 9 captives. I'd be very proud of that. I would take that to my grave with great pride. But they are politically consequential as well. Things happen beyond taking that captive by the hair and eventually maybe sacrificing them. That is, conflicts were materially devastating. And this is a kind of conflict that many of us would see today. And what do those sorts of conflicts imply? They imply armies, they imply infrastructure, provisioning, all of the things that the Pentagon worries about today. Let me return here as I come to the end of this presentation about conflict in a hot zone. Let's go back to the outskirts of Tikal, and we're going to look at an area where, again, I'll be digging in about a month or so. In the area between Tikal and a region to the side called Ethos, which is connected by a long valley. This sounds like some housing development. The Buena Vista Valley, it's so banal, but it is nonetheless the truth. You can get up on these escarpments and see a great deal. Now, one of the first things we noticed about LiDAR was, oh my gosh, we can actually determine partly what the date of these ruins are, because some have an almost melted appearance. They've been under the onslaught of the elements for some more centuries, and these date to the beginnings of Maya civilization, the pre-classic. And then to the side, do you see the crisp outlines, the very strongly determined, delineated forms, ones with very clear building structure? Those are from the time that interests me the most, when the Maya script and inscriptions are being involved. Now, what we have been able to determine as a result of a lot of arduous field work and also studying these sites over time is that we can divide these whole sectors according to probably their date, and we can say that something happened. Something terrible happened in this zone between the beginnings of Maya civilization, where people were living down in a much less protected zone, and then they're moving up. Something has happened to their threat environment. It is an embattled land, and it's one that involves fortifications of extraordinary complexity, of length, of apparently a systematic nature that have just been detected over the last year or two. And these we're now going to be excavating with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities and for the National Science Foundation. Now, if you look at this, you'll see, I hope, that there are a series of walls around this Group B. Let's get up close to them, and you'll see these long walls with deep trenches. This is not casual stuff. This is not about a few warriors sallying forth to grab or ambush someone on a jungle trail. This is about an entirely new kind of warfare. There are reservoirs up there. Why would you have a reservoir? You want to store water. Why would you want to store water? It's because sieges could potentially take place. And remember, it's not just Group B, it's not just Group C, which has moats and ramparts and bridges and additional causeways allowing you to move quickly up and down the escarpment and down below. It's about a system of citadels that is extending over, at this point, about 10 to 15 kilometers. And I have checked around. I know something about the archaeology of the New World. This is pretty unusual. Something very, very new is happening. And occasionally, it seems as though they didn't even finish the work. They gave up. Perhaps things went really badly. We've also discovered watchtowers. They're special facilities across this landscape which allowed them to communicate with each other on a high, distant land, presumably through, they could have fires, there could be all sorts of even calls that could be mutually intelligible across the space. Those watchtowers are indicated for you here in orange. So ultimately, as I wrap up this talk, and I hope I've communicated something of the excitement of being on my archaeology at this time, is of course to pose the necessary question, what were these citadels? What were these places that we're calling collectively La Cuernavilla? By the way, and I'm a little embarrassed to confess this, the term comes from Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. That's a Spanish word for the Hornburg. This is what comes of being besotted with Tolkien at 12 or 13 years of age, as many people were in this audience. Well, how to explain this? Well, the first is when we began to getting into those looters' pits or trenches up in the top of that escarpment in Cuernavilla itself, we began noticing the strangest architecture. The architecture had a distinctive kind of look which told us that this was not a local style. And in fact, it is the style associated with a marauding, aggressive empire, as many of us think it to be, located at the great city of Teotihuacan, just on the outskirts of Mexico City today. Now again, many of you have probably been to, or some of you have been to Teotihuacan, very different feel from a Maya site, but we now know, thanks to hieroglyphic research, particularly by my friend David Stewart, that there is a bruising relationship that existed between the city, about 1,000 kilometers away, and the Maya. Now, where does that relationship become clearest to us in hieroglyphic terms, in statements left by the Maya themselves? It becomes clear at Tikal. Tikal is where these are often explained. Tikal is where a specific historical figure is mentioned, and he is mentioned on a precise date, AD 378, and a little bit later. And his name was Siakak, which means born from fire. In itself, that incendiary word or label gives you a sense of some of the violence that would be here. Now, much later, the Maya would continue to talk about this person, and he's even depicted here on a rollout of a Maya pot, and I've highlighted his name over to the side. He introduces new titles. Some have suggested he introduces new war. I believe that to be the case, and I believe La Cuernavilla citadels are all about this particular moment in time in which something happens to the threat environment of the Maya, and there is a calculated response to it. Now, it isn't just a Tikal, but just a few very short distance from Cuernavilla itself is an inscription which I was studying with colleagues a couple years ago. Notice it dates to literally 3 years after the event in which he seems to come from Teotihuacan to Tikal. And here in this monument, which comes from a small site called Bejucal, again not far from La Cuernavilla, is a text which refers to the ruler of this area. We have a little bit of a dynastic sequence. It is a little bit of a patchy historical record, but the text could not be clearer. It says that the local king who existed at the time of that AD 378 event has become the underling of Siakak. And so whatever is going on here is obviously involving a troubled period. And it's one in which we have to ask, and we hope to be able to answer in a few short weeks, what might be going on here? And these are the analogies I've roughly thought of. Again, thinking of framing this for the public more generally, is it like a crusader castle in Syria, in which you have intrusive foreign peoples, warriors, who set themselves up in a foreboding kind of citadel in order to oppress a local population? And there might be some hint of that in this new style of architecture, which we're finding up in the escarpment. Or is it mostly a local response, if you will, a kind of Maginot Line of the sort that existed between Nazi Germany and Republican France? And as I said in my blurb, that story did not end very well. And that may have been the case here as well. So our concern is figuring above all who is doing the fighting, who is building these structures. And what we hope is that with the LiDAR, these galvanic changes in the nature of violence in the ancient world, in the ancient New World in particular, are going to come to us with a greater clarity than was possible before. And so in the thinking about their own idioms of describing conflict as flints and shields and fiery lords from far distant places, it's not only a re-imaging of ancient conflict, it is its very reimagining that we seek. Thank you. And I would be delighted to take any questions, and we have gentlemen here with microphones, no less. They're holding them up, and this is a great chance to get some Q&A. Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
I'm not an anthropologist, archaeologist, just a layperson. But I was curious, is ultrasonic mapping used in conjunction with LiDAR? Has LiDAR eclipsed that, or do they work better together?
Well, it's a very good question. We've got different ways of trying to access things that are ordinarily not visible. One approach has been used over the years are magnetometers and sledges, and there's radar. Generally speaking, when I've participated in those kinds of explorations, they're not very successful because a lot of the architecture and the fill under a Maya city consists of pebbles of stone, and so you just get a lot of bouncing cavities that are very hard to make out. And also, just to be able to operate those, you've got to cut a lot of forest. And so there's a kind of, almost an ecological virtue in using LiDAR because you don't have to cut so much. You can leave it alone and then come in with much more focused questions. But it's something we do hope to develop in the future. It's a good question indeed. Yes, this gentleman.
Is LiDAR expensive? Is it difficult to get that kind of results?
Oh, yes. And there will be a collection plate. No, we're not allowed to solicit money here. Yeah, it's shockingly expensive. Our colleagues in Cambodia who are doing dynamite work, Damien Evans and his crew, they bought their own LiDAR. It cost about $3 million. And I have to say, it was worth every penny and then some, as far as I'm concerned, or whatever the unit of currency might be in Cambodia. There is an agency that all of us, or most of us, work with, which is called NCALM, which has been at the University of Houston. It's a national center for the deployment of LiDAR, and they have a superb team. They do, however, have to eat, and so often the work has to be subsidized. To get an effective LiDAR capture of the sort we're looking at, and I wasn't involved in the budgeting, but it's close to $600,000-$700,000. And archaeologists are really frugal. We eat badly in the field. We don't care about it. We live badly. And so these sorts of budgets are just jaw-dropping for us. But it's obvious that if we get together and collaborate, some of the cost, the points will drop a little bit. But as I said, there are some philanthropies that have donated, and there's going to be very shortly another massive capture that will probably double or treble what I'm showing you today. And that's going to happen very soon, we hope. Oh, maybe someone in back, just to por variar. And yes, sir.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. That was really insightful. I was just wondering, how did you reconcile the picture that you paint of like the relationship between Teotihuacan and the Mayas with some of the stuff that like the Templo de las Columnas project with Nahuel Sugiyama and William Fash and the other ones have been doing, where like they have found a lot of Maya murals in Teotihuacan.
Yeah.
So kind of like complicates the notion, because I feel like a lot of the time it's always think of Teotihuacan going into the Maya area, but this project forces us to think the other way. I was just wondering.
Well, it's, of course, a longstanding idea. What the gentleman is alluding to is the fact that there are many sectors within Teotihuacan itself which are multi-ethnic, which have populations that appear to have been not of local origin. And this is something that's been emphasized probably from the 20s or 30s on. I think the very nature of an empire is one in which you're going to incorporate potentially subjugated populations. And they're going to be fascinated, I think, in particular by the literate skills of the Maya. There are legible Maya texts that have been recovered and known about for about 20, 30 years, if not longer, in Teotihuacan. So I find it actually completely reconcilable. The way to think about it analogically is to understand that there were Tibetan quarters within Beijing. There were, in ancient Rome, there might be a Jewish establishment, which is one of the oldest surviving Jewish communities in the world. And so the nature of empire is to be absorptive, is to bring people in, and I could see the Maya being easily involved in the same process. Yes, there was a gentleman here who had a question, I think, yeah. Didn't you have a question? Or you don't?
I wanted to ask you if you'd be kind enough to advise us if the LiDAR technology is similar or quite different from the technology that's been used recently for oil and gas exploration.
This comes in part from people that have a lot more money than we have. And so, yeah, the expertise is coming out of those kind of industries. I was speaking to a gentleman a few weeks ago, maybe it was you, sir, who was saying that there are yet more exciting developments. Now, LiDAR is not at the end stage of its refinement. I am told through privileged sources that LiDAR is now being so rapidly deployed in some areas that you can do a map, let's say, of Boston, in which every last smidgen of its surface is visible within a couple, maybe an hour or so. And so what I see is greater rapidity. According to what this gentleman was indicating before, we want the cost to come down so that all of the Amazon, let's say, will be accessed in this way. Because ultimately, it's not just a kind of intellectual greed in finding out more about the Maya, although I'm happy to indulge in that particular tendency. What is also involved is the proper management, is the clever, smart, intelligent management of these fast vanishing forests and how to go about doing it, how to go about doing so with a plan in which we actually have information about what's under the forest. What I'm not telling you so much tonight, because we are mostly here to discuss archaeology, is that information that I have so glibly thrown out about the vegetation is of crucial importance because it tells us every last species of tree potentially that we're getting. There are multispectral signatures coming off of them. They're telling us about local hydrology. And so the archaeology ideally is just going to be a very small aspect of this. But what I do see in the future is a smarter kind of policy planning, and that's ultimately where we want to be. Yes, sir. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much for that very fascinating presentation. Could you comment on how this new, the new revelations with LiDAR are informing the way there's a trickle-down information gathering from the researchers, the archaeologists, to the guides informing visitors to these archaeological sites?
Yeah, there is a well-established mechanism of schools and the like, depending on the local Guatemalan authorities or Mexican authorities or Belizean or Hondureño authorities, in which hopefully we disseminate the right information. Now, ethically, the way we proceed with this information is we always announce the results first in Spanish in the country where we are harvesting the information. It should not appear in a foreign press release first. That's offensive. In addition to that, the first access would be to, in this case, Guatemalan journalists. And we also hope to make training available to local Guatemalans, and many are involved in our projects. There is undeniably, though, the technological challenge, almost insuperable, of having the right equipment down there for people to do this high-level processing. And so ultimately, the injunction morally for someone like me is to bring up students to, let's say, Brown or other universities so that they can receive that training, and eventually, hopefully, it'll become possible. But another ethical issue that's become pressing is why are you letting all the looters know where the sites are? And let me tell you something. Are we all listening? Looters know where every last site is already. That's why we have a gazillion pits out there. And in fact, if you want to go to a ruin, you hire your local chopper or harvester of chicle, who happens also to be a looter because they are multitasking. And so, to me, it's quasi-ludicrous to think about it in those terms, but I have heard that argument. Perhaps just one or two more questions. What do you think, John? Yes, someone back here, please. Yeah, get some geographical diversity.
I was in Tikal in the 1970s, and I'm wondering whether there are findings or assumptions since then that have changed our image of the Maya.
Wow, yeah, enormously. I would segregate that, or my response, into basically three parts. The first would be that we know a lot more about the history. We actually can people that world with individuals who have intent, who have discernible stratagems, who have families, who are part of larger political networks, and that's really quite extraordinary. The other thing we've learned about Tikal is that these cities, such as they had, were just as carefully planned in some ways as what you might see here in DC. They're very concerned with hydrology. This is something my colleague Vern Scarborough has been working on very, very, very well, it seems to me. But then beyond that also, we're getting a sense for the larger populations. We're getting a sense of what sort of agriculture would support the people of Tikal. It isn't just about slash and burn agriculture. We now know, also thanks to LiDAR, and this was a component of my talk that I could not visit in any great length, that these are cities that had intensive fields. They were very concerned with generating as much agricultural productivity as possible to allow that population to be sustained. These were not unsuccessful people. The cities lasted for about 1,200 to 1,500 years. And I think by our clock, we should be so lucky. Thank you very much. Thank you. Nicely done.
I think you can see why the Library of Congress is so proud to have had Steve as the first Kislak chair in the study of the early Americas. And I hope you will stay around. There is a reception, and you can mingle. Thank you again, Steve.